In the first half of this conversation, I want to begin with an image: a wicker basket, sitting on the ground in the heat of equatorial Africa, sometime around the turn of the 20th century. And inside that basket, smoked to preserve them in the heat, are human hands, the severed right hands of men, of women, and of children. They have been cut off and collected and counted like a tally, like receipts, like proof of work done. That basket is real. It was photographed. It was witnessed and recorded by missionaries and investigators who could scarcely believe what they were seeing. And it is, perhaps, the single most honest symbol of one of the largest and least remembered atrocities in human history. Here is what I find almost impossible to hold in my mind. The man ultimately responsible for that basket, for a system of terror, mutilation, forced labor, and mass death across an area the size of Western Europe, never once set foot in the place. He never saw the Congo River. He never heard the screaming. He ran it all from palaces and seaside resorts thousands of miles away, in a small, wealthy, comfortable European country, signing documents, reading balance sheets, and growing fabulously rich. His name was Leopold II, King of the Belgians. And the territory he owned, not Belgium owned, he owned personally as a private possession, was called, with a straight face, the Congo Free State. It was not free. For its people, it was very nearly the opposite of a state. It was the private rubber plantation of one European king, run on a foundation of severed hands. This is its story, and I'm going to tell it as completely as I can, because forgetting it is its own kind of crime. Let's start with the man, because to understand the horror you have to understand the ambition behind it. Leopold II became King of the Belgians in 1865, and Belgium, you have to understand, was a small country, young, only formed in 1830, prosperous but minor, the kind of nation that the great powers of Europe looked past. Leopold was consumed by a sense that this was beneath him. He wanted Belgium to have an empire. He wanted colonies, the way Britain and France and the Netherlands had colonies, because in the 19th century, colonies meant prestige, and prestige meant power, and power was the only currency Leopold truly cared about. He famously complained that Belgium was too small for him, too small in country and too small in people. He looked at the map of the world, and he saw it being carved up by everyone but him, and he wanted his slice. He once described the unclaimed interior of Africa as this magnificent African cake, and he was determined to cut himself a piece. The problem was that the Belgian government and the Belgian public had no appetite for the expense and risk of colonial adventures. So Leopold did something extraordinary and deeply cynical. He decided that if his country wouldn't build him an empire, he would build one himself, privately, as an individual, and he would disguise the whole project as an act of charity. In the late 1870s, Leopold hired Henry Morton Stanley, the famous, ruthless Welsh-American explorer who had earlier found the missionary David Livingstone. Leopold sent Stanley to the Congo Basin not to explore for science, but to acquire. Stanley spent years traveling the region, and at hundreds of villages he got local chiefs to make their mark on treaties, documents written in languages the chiefs could not read, that they could not possibly have understood, signing away the sovereignty of their land and their people to a foreign king they had never heard of. In exchange, sometimes, for a few bolts of cloth, some trinkets, a bottle of gin, Stanley assembled, treaty by fraudulent treaty, the legal fiction of a vast territory under Leopold's control. And then came the masterstroke of public relations. Leopold wrapped this whole enterprise in the language of philanthropy and humanitarianism. He created an organization with a noble-sounding name, the International African Association, and he presented himself to the world not as a conqueror, but as a humanitarian, a man whose only desire was to bring Christianity, civilization, and an end to the East African slave trade to the dark interior of the continent. He hosted conferences. He gave money to scientific and missionary causes. He played the role of the enlightened, benevolent monarch so well that he convinced the world. The Con reached its triumph at the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, the infamous meeting where the European powers sat around a table and carved up Africa among themselves with no African present. There, through relentless diplomacy and his humanitarian disguise, Leopold got the major powers, including the United States, to recognize his personal claim. And so, in 1885, the Congo Free State was born, a territory of more than 2 million square kilometers, roughly 76 times the size of Belgium itself, recognized internationally as the private domain of one man. Not a Belgian colony, Leopold's colony. He was its absolute sovereign, answerable to no parliament, no voters, no one. One of the largest pieces of the African continent had become a single European king's personal property, and almost nobody yet understood what that would mean for the millions of people who lived there. At first, the money came from ivory, elephant tusks, harvested and shipped out to feed Europe's appetite for piano keys and billiard balls and ornaments. But ivory alone wasn't enough to satisfy Leopold's debts and ambitions. The colony was expensive to run, and for a while it lost money. And then history handed Leopold a fortune in the form of a single invention. In the late 1880s and 1890s, the industrial world went mad for rubber. The pneumatic tire had been developed, the air-filled rubber tire, and suddenly there was the bicycle craze, and then the dawn of the automobile, and the demand for rubber to make tires and hoses and insulation, and 1,000 other things exploded across Europe and America. And it turned out that the Congo rainforest was full of wild rubber, not plantation rubber, but rubber that grew naturally in tangled vines winding up through the trees. Leopold was sitting on top of one of the most valuable raw materials on Earth, at the exact moment the world's demand for it went vertical. And this is where the Congo Free State turned from a fraud into a nightmare. Because wild rubber is brutally difficult and dangerous to harvest. You have to go deep into the forest, find the vines, slash them, and let the sap bleed out. And one common method was to coat your own body in the latex and then peel it off your skin along with your hair. It was slow, painful, miserable work, and no one in their right mind would do it for the wages Leopold was willing to pay, which were essentially nothing. So Leopold's administration did not pay for the rubber. They took it, by force, through a system of terror so methodical that it became, in effect, a machine for converting human suffering into money. Here is how the machine worked. The territory was divided up, much of it handed to private concession companies, in which Leopold himself held large stakes, and the rest run directly by the state. Each region, each village, was assigned a quota, a fixed amount of rubber it had to deliver, on a schedule, at a price set by the state, which is to say, for almost nothing. And the enforcement of these quotas was placed in the hands of an armed force called the Force Publique, the colony's private army made up of African soldiers, many of them conscripted or enslaved from other regions, commanded by European officers. The Force Publique was not there to protect the Congolese. It was there to terrorize them into producing rubber. The everyday instrument of that terror was a whip called the chicotte. a vicious lash cut from sun-dried hippopotamus hide, twisted to a sharp edge. A flogging with the chicotte tore the skin. A serious sentence of 100 lashes could, and often did, kill the person receiving it. But the chicotte was only the beginning. To force a village to meet its rubber quota, the soldiers developed a particularly cruel and effective method. They took hostages. They would march into a village and seize the women and the children, the wives, the daughters, the mothers, and hold them captive, often in stockades, sometimes raping them, often starving them, until the men of the village went into the forest and came back with enough rubber to ransom their own families. Imagine the calculus of that. Your wife, your child, is in a cage. To get them back, you must produce an impossible weight of rubber from the deep forest. And if you fail, if the quota is short or late, the consequences fall on the people you love. And then there were the hands. This is the detail that has come to define the whole regime, and it deserves to be understood precisely, because the logic of it tells you everything about the system's cold heart. The European officers wanted to control their soldiers' use of ammunition. Cartridges were expensive, and they were worried that soldiers would waste bullets hunting animals for food or hoard them. So they instituted a rule. For every bullet a soldier fired, he had to account for it by bringing back proof that it had been used to kill a person in the course of enforcing the rubber regime. And the proof they demanded was a human right hand, a severed hand for every cartridge spent. Think about what that rule actually produced in practice. A soldier who fired at someone and missed, or who used a bullet to shoot an animal, now had to produce a hand anyway, or face punishment himself. So he would simply cut the hand off someone else, off a living person, off whoever was nearby. The hands were severed from the dead and from the living alike. They were smoked over fires to preserve them in the tropical heat. They were brought back in baskets and counted. They became a kind of grotesque currency, proof of work, evidence of diligence, a number in a ledger. Children's hands, women's hands, whole baskets of them. Some Congolese were left alive but maimed, missing a hand, marked forever. And villages that resisted, or simply could not produce enough, were burned to the ground, their people massacred as an example to the others. This was not occasional. It was not the work of a few bad individuals going rogue. It was the system operating as designed across an enormous territory year after year for the better part of 2 decades. The point of all of it, the chicotte, the hostages, the burned villages, the severed hands, was to terrorize hundreds of thousands of people into harvesting rubber for a king on the other side of the world. Now I have to talk about the human cost, and I have to be honest with you about what we know and what we don't, because the truth here is contested, and it matters that I don't overstate it. The Congo Free State kept no honest census of the people it was destroying. The records that did exist were, as we'll see, deliberately burned. So the death toll is, and will always be, an estimate. The most famous figure, popularized by the historian Adam Hochschild, whose book King Leopold's Ghost brought this story back into the world's memory, is that the population of the Congo fell by around 10 million people, roughly half, during the Free State period. That number comes from serious work, including a Belgian government commission's own conclusion that about half the population had perished. But I have to tell you that this figure is disputed. Some demographers, including a scholar whose research Hochschild originally relied on, have since argued that the true number was lower, that the data was extrapolated too broadly from the worst rubber districts, and that the decline, while still catastrophic, may have been in the range of a few million rather than 10. The honest answer is that we do not know the exact toll, and we never will. The estimates run from somewhere around 1 million at the most cautious end, up to 10 million or more at the most cited. But here is what is not in dispute. By any of these estimates, an immense number of human beings died, and a whole society was shattered. And that's it for part 1. Thank you for sitting with me here in the quiet dark. If this story moved you, learn more. Say their names. Share it so others know. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you for part 2.